Hello, I'm Charanya. I have about 10 years of experience working on strategy, the last couple of years, particularly in the payment space. And I'm excited to walk you through the landscape that we've seen, particularly after the onset of COVID. So, what are consumers thinking about cash? What are consumers thinking about crypto after COVID 19 happened to the world? So it's very evident that COVID has impacted consumer sentiment globally. And this is the brief gist of what I will be walking you through over the next few minutes, with a lot of data to back up each of these statements. So COVID has impacted consumer sentiment globally. We do see that spending is shifting towards essential goods, which are mostly purchased through online methodologies using digital transactions. Obviously, cash is therefore becoming outdated, and digital transactions are gaining popularity. Bitcoin awareness and trust has been increasing, and more people are claiming to be crypto aficionados. So we see here that consumer optimism has decreased, and households are planning to decrease spending. We see a country by country view over here. If you look at most of the countries in the world, Korea, Australia, US, Mexico, Spain, UK, Italy, most of these countries are less optimistic after COVID 19 struck, and they plan to decrease household spending. There are a few exceptions to this. The first one, obviously, is Indonesia. They're somewhere in the middle of the spectrum when it comes to optimism. However, households are planning to increase spending. And we do see some countries like India and China, which are a little more optimistic about recovery. China, definitely so, because they have been fairly successful at containing it early on. We see a few countries like Brazil and France, which have been impacted pretty strongly, yet households are not planning to decrease their spending as much. So very interesting consumer behavior and reactions to COVID that seems to vary across geographies. Well, when this onset happened, no one expected it was going to last this long. People were like, when things return to normal. But I guess now, 4 months down the line, our sense of normalcy has been distorted. I think the expectation now is unless a vaccine comes our way, or unless the virus magically disappears, like how it happened in the historical evidences of when flu struck the world, we do see that C19 impact is here to stay for several months. So the blue boxes are where consumers feel the impact is going to stay for 2 or 3 months. The impact in terms of how it impacted their routines, and also how their household finance has been affected. The orange here is the percentage of consumers who feel that COVID is going to last for 4 months or more. So with spending we're shifting towards essential goods, and purchases are now becoming more online and digital. Let's see how consumers in different countries are sort of, how the trend is progressing across different countries. So here we see, this is data from McKinsey, which tells us that, what's really happening to different categories of spend. So we see 3 different categories of spend here for each country. The blue circles are household essentials. The orange circles are discretionary purchases. And the green ones it's home entertainment, basically just Netflix and those. So here we do find that, and if you look at the quadrants, for the first graph particularly, I've labeled them as 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you find something in the first quadrant, that typically means the spend has increased, both in store and online. If you find something in the second quadrant, it means it's heavily in store. The online purchase has decreased. If you see something in quadrant 3, it means the overall purchase of that category has decreased. And if you see something in quadrant 4, it means it's moved to an entirely online space, and the in-store purchase of those goods has completely declined. So what we see in the US is pretty interesting. We see that household essentials are typically moving towards the online space, with groceries somewhat there's still a certain extent of in-store purchases happening there. For discretionary items, particularly apparel, we see a complete decline in spend. For all the four countries, home entertainment is obviously digital. And then if we look at UK, it's somewhat similar to the US, where your essential purchases are moving online, with groceries somewhat straddling your online and in-store space. Discretionary spending has almost completely been cut in the UK. We see slightly differing trends in Germany and Italy. So if we look at Germany, for instance, we see that household essentials is still largely in store, which is a very interesting trend. But we still see that discretionary purchases have declined. And then in Italy, we also find that most of the household essentials are still, the in-store purchases are still happening. We see a similar trend like Germany and Italy in other parts of Europe, like Spain and France. So let's take a look at a few other countries moving to Asia. China. It's like almost all spending has moved to online, except consumer electronics. We don't see too much of a decline in spend. And this ties to the initial slide where I said the optimism has generally been pretty high in China. And even in India, the digital transformation has been pretty rapid in the last couple of years. And we find that we don't find a decrease in discretionary purchases like how we saw in some countries of the West. Discretionary purchases have now moved online in India. Japan is sort of similar to some countries of Europe, where we find that essentials are being purchased in store, and discretionary purchases have declined. In Indonesia, it's at a different scale altogether, where we find almost all categories are to the extreme right, where online behavior has completely taken off in Indonesia. So what happens? What happens when people's purchases of discretionary items is decreasing, when essential goods has moved to like online transactions and digital transactions? Even when people are buying these essentials in store in places like Germany and Italy, are they handing out cash, or are they using alternative digital forms of payment? Let's take a look. Yeah. Cash is getting outdated across the world. So this was some internal research we did, and we found that, so the way to interpret this graph is all the dark blue dots represent cash, and the y-axis represent a decline. So the survey, we asked consumers were, which of these are you doing more and which of these are you doing less? And the dots here show you like the aggregate differences between more versus less. So if you look at cash, the dark blue dots, it's completely and clearly negative across all countries of the world. If you look at the light green dots, which is online payments through digital wallets, that has taken off. If you look at the gray dots, which is contactless phones, so using a digital mode of payment, but you're doing it in person in the store. Clearly, that has also taken off after COVID struck. What's interesting here is, like, let's take a look at the yellow dot, which is crypto or other blockchain currency for purchases. It has, people are claiming that it has declined a little bit. But the way to interpret this data is slightly different. It's like the number of people who are using this more versus the number of people who are using this lesser. We did find that for crypto, there was a huge volume of people who said there was not a change in their spending. So it means that they weren't using crypto as much to pay previously, and they aren't using crypto as much to pay right now. And we do find that Bitcoin awareness and trust has been on the rise. So the blue graphs represent consumer sentiment in 2017, and the orange is consumer sentiment in 2020. This was sourced from secondary research. So we do find that Bitcoin familiarity, if we look at the first graph, yes, the people who claim that they're owning Bitcoin, the people who are claiming they're familiar with Bitcoin has increased, and the people who are claiming they haven't heard of Bitcoin has declined in 2020. And what's happening to trust? So this was specifically done after the COVID outbreak, and it's very interesting here. Trust is shifting clearly from banks to Bitcoins. And if you look at the proportion, it sort of remains the same, 19 to 49% and 82% to 55%. So it's like largely you have this 30-ish% transfer from Bitcoin to banks. So what does awareness have to do? What about action? So we do find that the likelihood of buying Bitcoin has definitely increased in 2020. So the orange graph, it shows that the people who are very likely to buy Bitcoin and somewhat likely to buy Bitcoin is higher. And those who claim that they're not at all likely to buy has declined a little bit. And there is greater clarity on what to do with Bitcoin. So if you look at the second graph here, the number of people who say that they're not sure about what to do with Bitcoins, that has declined. And we see a greater proportion of people who are interested in holding on to Bitcoins or selling Bitcoins. Well, of course, I guess many of you here would be aware of this. Crypto is getting highly democratized with Bitcoin losing its share. So when we look at 2015, where the total market cap of crypto was around 7 billion, and as of today, it's around 250 billion, keeps swinging a little bit, but averages out here. We do find that Bitcoin had an 86% share in 2015. And that gradually declines 80%, 72% to around 50s in the 2018 and 2019. In 2020, it's around 66%. So yes, if we look at the overall trends, we do find that Bitcoin is losing trends and other players are gaining traction. Ethereum obviously has gained quite a bit of share. I think this 2020 data has only been in the last couple of months, so we'll have to wait towards the end of the year to understand what the overarching trend looks like for Bitcoin versus Ethereum. But overall, we do find this trend where some of these newer players are increasingly gaining more market share. And what's interesting is a lot of people are now claiming to be crypto aficionados. So we do know that the blockchain wallet users have steadily been on the rise since 2016 till right now. And this is interesting because we do see that in countries like Brazil, China, Japan, there are lots of people who see themselves as crypto aficionados. So the dark blue dots here are people who say they are Bitcoin aficionados. The orange ones are people who say, yes, I've sort of been thinking about Bitcoin, but I'm not really sure. The gray ones are people who are like, yes, I'm curious, but I haven't tried. And the yellow ones are like, leave me out of this. So clearly we do see that, blue and orange tends to ride higher than the yellow here, with Australia being a possible exception. So it's interesting that, the difference between people who are claiming they're crypto aficionados versus people who want to stick to old currency is very profound in places like Brazil, China, Japan. And that is quite an interesting trend because data here shows that most active traders are still in the US, Europe, and they're concentrated in Japan as well. So it's interesting because 1 out of 2 traders still use Coinbase to buy, sell, and manage portfolio. And so what's the difference between the previous chart and this? We do find that traders in this particular analysis was defined very specifically as those who use exchanges to trade cryptocurrency, whereas the general users in the previous slide are people who sort of like have some Bitcoin in their wallets and are dabbling with it. And the previous graph also shows a consumer's inclination towards the idea of cryptocurrency. So all those people who claim to be crypto aficionados might not be trading Bitcoins. They probably are just interested in understanding the space more or have been constantly reading up on the space. to sort of conclude this here, so when we say the word blockchain, what truly are people thinking of in different countries? And we do see a bit of a variation here. So we look at Brazil. Risky is the first thing that comes to people's mind. And this is a country where, the inclination towards Bitcoin is pretty high. And yet many people feel it is risky. Perhaps that explains some of the difference between, why there's a difference between, the traders still being concentrated in the US and the West and Japan, versus there being a lot of enthusiasm in Brazil, but still reluctance to actually trade with this. The word trustworthy comes to their mind, and Ethereum. If we look at some other associations here, for instance, China. For China, the top association with blockchain is very evidently like bitcoins or cryptocurrency. And that's somewhat similar to the US, where again in the US, blockchain is highly associated with the application of cryptocurrency and bitcoins. We see a lot of trustworthy there. So Brazil, China, India, France, they all feel Bitcoin is pretty trustworthy. Secure is another word that's on top of people's mind when they hear the word blockchain. India, Mexico, Germany, Australia, UK, all of these countries feel like blockchain is fairly secure. Japan and Mexico get a little technical here, where they associate blockchain with distributed ledger technology, not so much in other countries. And it's interesting because India and Germany also see blockchain as distribution of power, which enables co-creation. So with this, we come to the end of this presentation.